Welcome to ePODstemology.
Epistemology. You know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. What is this?
It's a podcast. Hello listeners, thanks for joining me for another episode of ePODstemology, the show where we invite you to converse with some of the leading early career researchers and other thoughtful young folk out and about anything and everything. Our stock in trade is fresh galaxy brain takes. I'm your host, Dr Mark Fabian from Cambridge University, and my guest this week is Dr Rehema Msulwa, also from Cambridge University, and also from my department, the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. Check us out, we do good work. Rehema is an expert on infrastructure. What is it? What is it for? How should we pay for it? How should we govern it? How can we stop cronies from using infrastructure as an opportunity to pilfer the public purse? And how can we get local knowledge into the infrastructure development process without getting hopelessly mired in NIMBYism? All these questions and more will be answered on today's episode. So fire up your phone and browse a few photos of railways, sewerage systems, and other grand examples of the infrastructure we can't live without. That'll get you in the mood while we get this show on the road.
Use my knowledge, I beg you.
ePODstemology.
So welcome Rehema Msulwa to ePODstemology.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for having me.
So could you tell us please a bit about your research interests and what projects you have on the go?
Okay, sounds good. So I'm an infrastructure researcher, essentially. I'm trained as an applied economist and did my PhD in a business school where I studied the governance and essentially the management of the very front end of infrastructure projects. What this entails is thinking about how multiple parties with different interests in infrastructure, so think local communities, national government, investors, etc., come together to conceptualize the infrastructure front end and create a project concept that they can then advance through delivery and operation. Broadly, the research is multidisciplinary, so I draw on, as I said, some management, organization, design type thinking, heavily on collective action and the work of Elinor Ostrom in particular. And then also thinking a bit about economic geography and what this means for places. In terms of specific projects, I'm currently working on a few papers. So one that tries to conceptualize the front end in terms of the attributes that we would normally think about when we characterize economic goods. So your club goods, private goods, public goods. What's the fourth one?
I don't know, non-rival, common pool resources?
Yeah, common pool resources, which is actually, so it's trying to think about how we might think about the very front end of infrastructure projects through that lens of thinking, right? And whether it is a static conceptualization or whether it's dynamic that changes over time as the actors in the front end change. And then I'm also working on a project that considers the capabilities that organizations require when they are working at the intersection of the public and the private sector, right? In this case, what you have is a hybrid sort of dynamic environment again, where for the private sector, notions of value tend to be fixed, right? Broadly speaking, private corporations have to produce shareholder value and they're thinking about profit, right? In infrastructure projects where you have private organizations working with the government, they are then working alongside a more fluid sense of value, right? Value, if we think about in the UK context, for example, we're currently talking about leveling up, net zero, etc. And so an infrastructure project currently, and infrastructure project promoters have to work at initially constructing this collective sense of what value is, right? And so I'm interested in the capabilities required to operate in that in that environment, which would be different from a purely private environment or from a purely public environment. And then finally, also more recently, thinking about digitization in construction and what that means for how we value work in construction, right? So projects are becoming increasingly digital, but we know that productivity in the construction sector has been low or falling in some places. So what does digitalization mean for that? Are we actually measuring productivity effectively in this context? And can we measure it better? So that's me.
Wonderful, fascinating stuff. I should probably have a whole separate episode just on productivity and like what's going on there, because I think that's one of the biggest kind of topics in economics at the moment. All right, that all sounds really interesting. So maybe I'll start with just a really sort of basic question. Like, what is infrastructure, and what are some examples of infrastructure that people might not immediately think of?
So infrastructure is essentially the spatial skeleton that supports housing, industry, economic activity, public services, right? So these are traditionally thought of as the physical systems that support public services too, like energy networks and electricity, transport networks, rail, road, air travel, you have telecommunications, etc. I think it's really about the wheels that keep the economy turning. Sometimes we take it for granted, and the systems that enable both economic activity and other activity more broadly, really. In terms of, so as I said, traditionally it's been physical infrastructure and economic infrastructure, but you have social infrastructure also. So more recently, there's been talk about social infrastructure, and this is essentially the social plumbing. So again, the scaffolding, the skeleton, the systems that enable, in this context, that bring people together to build meaningful relationships. So in this context, you might think of libraries, leisure centers, and community centers.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. And some of your research is on social infrastructure specifically?
No, so my research mainly focuses on physical infrastructure or economic infrastructure, with a particular focus on very large-scale infrastructure projects, sometimes called mega projects. These are 1 billion plus projects that bring together, as you can imagine, many parties with many interests, sometimes in support of the project and sometimes strongly in opposition to the project.
What are some examples of mega projects?
So in the UK at the moment, there's High Speed 2, which is a proposed high-speed railway that would connect the north and the south of the UK. It is the largest infrastructure project in the UK in some time. Beyond that, there's also the proposed Sizewell C nuclear power plant.
Oh, yeah.
Right, which is, I think, the second largest infrastructure project in the UK at the moment. So essentially very large scale infrastructure projects that would significantly influence both public policy and the distribution of people and goods in specific spatial locations, but also more broadly.
Oh, cool. This has reminded me of an anecdote the other night from Diane Coyle about Victorian era sewerage infrastructure, and that the London sewer system in today's dollars would have cost something like 285 billion to produce, or something astronomical like that. So that would definitely class as a mega project.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so, and I guess the interesting thing about sort of building on Diane's point is the idea that part of building that infrastructure projects required foresight that, you know, came from somewhere about the fact that it would influence the way economic activity or the way life played out today, right? So at the time, I can imagine that the size of the project or the capacity of the project was well beyond what was needed then. But so another feature of infrastructure projects is that they do shape and sort of are products of spatial engineering, if you will, and social engineering that can shape things for years, decades to come.
So I guess a simple example of that would be like if you build a railway line that's sort of under capacity, you would expect that people will start to construct commercial and residential operations along that railway line. Is that the idea?
Absolutely, absolutely. So ideally, and this is not always the case, infrastructure planning would be infrastructure planning at the sort of more high level would be integrated with local development plans, right? In part because, as you're saying, people may start building residential areas or businesses alongside an infrastructure project, and it can shape the way things pan out over a decade. So there's definitely path dependence there that needs to be taken into account.
Okay, cool. Well, hopefully we can come back to this a bit later when we talk about how we study infrastructure and stuff, because I'm particularly interested in the sort of cost-benefit analysis dimensions of this. So I remember Canberra, where I did my PhD, installed a light rail network a couple of years ago amidst much chagrin from the economics community because it really didn't seem to pass cost-benefit analysis relative to just expanding the bus network, basically. So the counterfactual was not do nothing. It was a different infrastructure investment, but much less of a hard infrastructure investment. And then there's been a lot of tomfoolery since, like, when they did open the railway line, a lot of the economists who'd commented on it anticipated that no one would use it because it was in a reasonable location, but just not a location that would get that much usage. And it was already one area where a lot of people drove, and they're the kind of people that you wouldn't really expect to shift away from driving. Like, I can sort of grasp the environmental idea. Okay, well, a lot of people drive, so we need to stop them driving. Let's give them a train. But they're just not the types who wouldn't drive. But anyway, what the government then did was that they just rerouted all the bus networks to quite inefficiently channel people into the tram. Yeah, so that way the tram is now not a loss-making venture, even though that's what sort of everyone anticipated. But it's an interesting lesson in opportunity cost, because even though on the books it doesn't look like a loss-making venture, because now everyone takes an extra 20 minutes to get to work, it's probably sort of colossally expensive from a utility point of view. But I remember talking to someone from the Productivity Commission shortly afterwards, and they were saying, like, yeah, but it's kind of difficult to trust the cost-benefit analysis because the government was quite explicit that their intention is to sort of build a spine for Canberra's development longer term, and it is something that will change the nature of the city's development from a very, like, sprawling car-oriented city to likely a more dense one. And so it's kind of hard to predict the cost benefit analysis is very endogenous to whether you have the network or not.
I think the other thing about it is, so cost benefit analysis is a marginal analysis, and sometimes these projects are transformative, right? So already the model breaks down, but at the same time, some of these benefits you can't monetize. There are no models to sort of monetize the wider benefits of an infrastructure project, right? And this also feeds into, if you consider some of the natural benefits, natural capitals type benefits that come from infrastructure projects, we don't know how to monetize biodiversity benefits, right? We don't necessarily know how to monetize the climate change type benefits within our cost benefit analysis structure of things. So these projects can definitely be transformative, which the cost benefit analysis just wasn't built for, and two, you can't monetize some of these benefits because we just don't know how. I guess thirdly is we just don't know what it's going to do. Some of this we have to wait and see.
It's just really unpredictable. Well, let's stay on this topic for a bit longer then. So you've mentioned some of the sort of important benefits around infrastructure. Like, more broadly, why should we care about infrastructure? What's its significance to our lives?
I can sort of come to this by explaining how I came to infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
So
cool.
I came to studying infrastructure in part because as a master's student, I did an internship with an economic geographer in South Africa, where we were studying urban development and essentially looking at the growth trajectory of localities in South Africa post-apartheid, right? So at the time, it was probably 1994 to, what was it then? Maybe 2010. And part of what came out in the research was that the profile of these places were very similar to pre-apartheid, right?
Right, sure.
So there is a spatial legacy that remains in the country that was engineered at a time, right? So that the country would develop in a certain way. And in South Africa, this was across racial lines, right? So you have, for example, poor, more disadvantaged people, often Black, living furthest away from jobs, having to commute long hours to get to work and sort of out of work. In South Africa, they would, because the system was built around migrant labor, they would tend to live in very highly dense informal settlements or townships, right? You have multiple where they live in sort of shack dwellings, if you will, limited access to public services, electricity, water, you name it, right? And this can be contrasted, and there are pictures online of this. This can be then contrasted with your more suburban areas where you have well off at that time, often white or Indian Asian people living in well-organized suburban places, access to public services, gardens, etc., right? And I guess one of the tragic things about South Africa is sometimes these are often side by side, right?
Yeah.
And so if you think about the fact that part of the reason this endures is because of the spatial engineering and where infrastructure networks, etc., were put, right? It highlights the importance of where your transport network is. Okay, you have a large workforce that lives far away from jobs. Do they have adequate transport systems that can get them to the jobs, right? What does it mean that they don't have electricity and water? Again, for access to jobs, but also for their quality of life. Today, if you think about it in the context of COVID, what does it mean that the more disadvantaged people have less access to broadband, right?
Right, sure.
In terms of everything, applying for jobs, working from home, students in university, can they take online exams? Can they take online classes, etc., right? So I think coming back to your question, why should we care about infrastructure? We should care about it because it enables both economic activity and it can significantly affect people's quality of life. And also going back to the idea of path dependence, decisions we make today about infrastructure can have a significant influence on the economic development trajectory of places and can affect people and groups of people in adverse ways if these things are not considered in detail.
Wonderful. That was a really great answer. So speaking of these things that are not considered in great detail, so I know that one of the sort of important developments in the last, decade, maybe more, in infrastructure that you also work on is this environmental, social and governance benefits or costs associated with infrastructure projects. So not just looking at the financial aspects, but these other things. So can you just elaborate a bit more on what are some of the ESG things associated with infrastructure and how are they not integrated in the past? How are we trying to do that today?
Okay, so I'll start off by saying the principles of ESG are important, but its take-up is not very clear at the moment, right? In part because there is no standard approach to embedding it in our decision-making, right? So environmentally, it's taking into account, and at the same time, I guess it can be applied to with an infrastructure project, or the delivery of an infrastructure project, for example, it can be applied to various stages of the infrastructure project lifecycle, right? So if we think about the very front end of infrastructure, environmental benefits can be considering your carbon emissions, right? From infrastructure projects, considering the biodiversity implications of infrastructure projects, considering the implications for air quality, etc., right?
Yep.
Social can be the extent to which during construction you will create jobs in the community, taking into consideration diversity on your workforce, which is especially important in this case because infrastructure tends to be male-dominated, construction tends to be male-dominated. It's also how can you ensure that local businesses and local suppliers are part of the process of developing a project, right? So that they also benefit from the project. From a governance perspective, it's taking into account, well, yeah, I might fumble this actually.
Sure.
But it's ensuring that you have transparent governance systems and fair governance systems, right? I imagine it's a fair allocation of risk and reward, right? And so it's important to account for ESG, but again, because we don't have a standard, there are debates going on at present about, for example, whether some of this stuff is just greenwashing, right? Is it just PR and do we just slap an ESG label on there? But actually it's just about getting a more beneficial cost of capital, for example, or to the benefit of investors. So ESG is important. ESG considerations are very important. And there's scope for more work about how to better incorporate it into thinking about infrastructure.
Okay, great. That brings us very nicely to my next question, which is how is infrastructure currently produced and governed? I don't know if you want to talk about that globally or just in the UK or whatever, but I'll leave it open to you because it's a big question.
Yeah, I'll answer it broadly. So given sort of technical features such as economies of scale and the externalities and spillovers from infrastructure, it's very difficult for large-scale infrastructure, at least, to be purely privately provided, right? Because private provision is often interested in bankability. So they want certain cash flows from the project and they want to know that our investments will be paid off. Because of that, infrastructure tends to be publicly provided, right?
Sure.
And publicly governed. But at the same time, because of the scale of the need for infrastructure, the public sector can't go it alone. So you often have public-private collaborations, public-private partnerships for the production of, for sort of the governance and production of infrastructure. And this may vary in terms of the development and construction and ultimate operation of it, right? So the government may have the muscle for the development or financing of it because they have more favorable interest rates. The private sector may be better placed to construct or operate the infrastructure project. And so it tends to be a mix of the two, but yeah, government has a huge role to play in part because, as I said, the private sector needs a guarantee that they will have a return on their investment. Sure.
Okay. And then, so you mentioned already a bit the kind of public-private nexus. So what is can you just, I know that a topic in this area is sort of public-private partnerships and their complexities. So, and you talked a bit about how a private organization might be better off, might be better suited to managing or operating an infrastructure project, but not necessarily building it. So in the interests of kind of enlightening citizens or making citizens better able to hold their governments to account and that sort of thing. Like, what is sort of the record of private-public partnerships, and is there any way for citizens to kind of notice red flags for when a public-private partnership is dodgy versus when it's a kind of reasonable proposal?
I think a big part of this may be demanding more transparency, right? So in the UK, I know where the public sector is involved, there's the freedom of information where you can request information about a project, right? But yeah, I'm not sure it's always obvious. And part of the reason is that it's always obvious sort of how to understand some of the red flags on projects, right? Or how to, obviously, you'll have interest groups, for example, environmental interest groups, who will be very clear about the adverse effects that a project may have on the environment, right? But there are also things like that are hidden below the surface sometimes, like modern slavery, for example, right? Which wouldn't necessarily be clear at first glance. And part of that is because infrastructure projects tend to have multiple layers of suppliers. So yesterday I attended the Cambridge University Enterprise Chris Abel postdoc commercialization competition or something, where postdocs essentially pitch their idea to commercialize it. And last year's winner, Sean Baker, I can't recall his company name at this time, but he was talking about how he won last year pitching an idea about essentially an AI technology that maps the networks of supply chains and lets businesses know where there are potential vulnerabilities in their supply chains. This is essentially a huge exercise because these supply chains span different countries, right? They're different sizes. So understanding where potential vulnerabilities are requires a full picture of the supply chain, if you will, that is not always available. So I think definitely demanding transparency and partnering or identifying organizations working in the space, interest groups that are working in the space, that, and listening to their arguments, right? Sometimes it's a bit extreme. Sometimes there's something in there, right? And so listening to those arguments. And then for those working on infrastructure projects, I think there's something to be said, sort of reflecting on Sean Baker's presentation yesterday, reflecting on what the network producing the infrastructure project looks like, and where the potential sensitivities lie.
Okay, that's good stuff. What about at the governance level? So I'm thinking in particular of these transfer arrangements. So I guess it seems to me pretty common for governments to build infrastructure out of the public purse and then transfer that asset to a private provider in a way that the private provider clearly underpays for the right to operate it, it seems to me. So I'm always very suspicious when a transfer like that happens that doesn't involve an auction, basically. So like if I, so I'll give you like one example that I thought was done reasonably well. The New South Wales government in Australia a few years ago privatized the stamp duty registry. I might be getting the details slightly wrong, but they needed a bunch of money to build light rail. And one of the few assets that they had to sell was the stamp duty registry. So obviously that's a flow of money. And so what they did, as I understand it, was they fixed the price that you could charge people to file a household change, like a lead, that's not the word for, a title change, like who owns a piece of property. They said, you can charge this much for it and you can have the lease for 50 years or whatever. So you guys work out the profit stream that you're going to make off this, what your costs are going to be, how much profit you can make, and then come to the auction and bid what you think the value of this thing is. And then a lot of the major banks and other kind of asset managers in Australia came in to bid on this asset because it was worth a lot of money. And in an auction, you can sort of have a bit more confidence that you're going to get to the actual value of the asset rather than just a mates rates kind of situation. And competitive tendering always seems to me like quite an opaque situation. Like, yes, you have transparency in the sense that people can look at the tenders, but it's not like we then put it to a vote on the basis of which one of those tenders was the best, because it might still just be that someone's a donor, or there's other sort of network effects there that mean that not the best person gets the tender, and the public paid all this money for this infrastructure project. And then just at the time that they could recoup a lot of those costs, they instead ship it out to some private provider so that those benefits can be privatized. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of thing?
Okay, so the auction of the stamp duty, I guess, portfolio sounds like a great idea. And a key thing there is that they fix the price so that for the private sector, there is a reliable cash flow, right? This comes back to bankability. This comes back to certainty of revenues, right? So that was obviously a very attractive asset to a number of private investors. I think part of the process of infrastructure projects is the market engagement. So the extent to which you have a large pool of private actors that are interested will not always be the same, right? So both interested and able to take on the asset, right? So that's one thing. On competitive tendering, you're absolutely right that it is opaque, but also another shortcoming is that it is often based solely on price, right? So again, it's based solely on price, where that undermines some other potential benefits, such as innovation, such as quality, etc. Right? So the challenge with a competitive tendering process based solely on price is that you have a race to the bottom. Everybody is putting forward the lowest price they can pay for it, or they're willing to take for it, but it may undermine the quality of things, right? So with that, it's absolutely not always the best way to go about it. And yeah, what could it say? The system needs to be transformed.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, it's good to know that people are working on these things. So then sticking with this governance theme for a bit longer, I know that one of the main themes in your research is sort of local involvement in infrastructure development and governance. So what is the benefit of that sort of collective action approach?
So this goes back to our discussion around the importance of infrastructure, right? And the idea that infrastructure affects places and affects real people, right? It's cost-benefit analysis is great. We get a number, etc., but behind those numbers are real people and real places. So the idea, and also, I guess, infrastructure projects also have a distributional effect. So there will be losers and there will be winners. And it's important to take those things into account. Local information in this context is important because places and people at the local level tend to have fine-grained information about how the place is developing, where they want the place to go, how they see the place developing, right? And so part of my research is to, one, see how that informs an infrastructure project's conceptualization, or the development of the project concept, and how that can be taken into account. And so, for example, the high-speed 2 train, I did some research on high-speed 2 for my PhD, and part of that was, initially, it was a railway station that connects the north and the south. We'll have a Y-shaped railway station connecting the north and the south to address the regional inequality in the UK.
Yeah.
And then you pitch the station to local authorities, and then, for example, Manchester says, actually, you've proposed a station here, but we think you should integrate it with our existing station, because this is how our plans look, right?
Right.
Sheffield says, you've proposed the station just outside of the city center. If you do that, you will reorganize the development of the city, because you will be drawing economic activity out of the center into the periphery, but not quite the periphery, right? And so ultimately the design was changed, and Sheffield does no longer get a station, they'll get an interchange, right? Leeds says, thanks, the station is great, but our plans are such that we want an integrated station, because this is how our city will develop, right? And these are the plans we have for the future. And so that information, there was no way for that information to come from the top, because it requires the detailed, fine-grained information at the local level. And I think part of my reflections on the High-Speed 2 case is that in this context, we're talking about large cities that have those plans in place, right? They've thought about it, well, at least Manchester and Leeds. They've thought about it, and, they're ready to go. But there are other places that haven't necessarily thought about things on that level, that would be disadvantaged by a process like this, or wouldn't be able to use an infrastructure project or the development of an infrastructure project to their advantage, right? So, and with that, then there's potential to further entrench spatial inequalities, right? So infrastructure, and local information and local input and the collective action process, the collective process of developing the scope of an infrastructure project is important, because, again, it affects real people, it affects real places. But then with that, there is also something to be said about ensuring that local places have the capacity to inform these decisions and to participate in this decision-making, so that we do not reinforce existing patterns of growth and development.
Okay, great. So let's talk about that for a bit. So two things I want to ask you about. One is about how you deal with NIMBYs in this process, but we can come to that. So I guess my other than is what is this process of involving local people, or of trying to do sort of co-production across a large number of stakeholders on one of these difficult processes? So what's the basic process there? And then do you have any thoughts on the last point you just made, for example, about, well, if that process is just captured by the people who are in power anyway, then you're really just going to keep doing what you're already doing, and that might not take account of local power dynamics, for example. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think I would say firstly that there is something that the process can definitely take away from your research on co-production, right? Because at the moment it's consultations that are often mandated by the legal system, right? So with High-Speed 2, for example, for High-Speed 2 to get passed as a project, it would have to go through judicial review. Judicial review, and it would, not judicial review, sorry, it would have to, it would get a hybrid bill, right? And for a hybrid bill to be passed, it would require that it has taken into account both private and public interests, and has considered both the private and public impacts of a project. And with that, it therefore needs to either mitigate public impacts or demonstrate that it has taken these into account, and that it has, be able to list out essentially why it hasn't incorporated certain amendments, right? And so the part of the consultation process is in part listening to your arguments for and against the project, and incorporating those that we can, and building an argument against those that we can't, so that we can defend ourselves when we go before Parliament for hybrid vote proceedings, right? I think the way that the process is structured is that we come to you to comment on a concept that we have already developed one way or the other, right? So we already have a Y shape that will go from London to Birmingham, to Leeds and Manchester and Sheffield, etc. And this is the project. What do you think of the project? What do you think of the stations, etc.? But this is the why rail line is already set, right? A different approach may be, we are thinking about a railway project. Where should it go? Right?
Right, sure.
Co-production in the real sense, where it is shaping the initial concept of the project, right? Rather than a desktop exercise that says, okay, we want to go north-south, therefore we should connect these places. Let's go consult these people, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I guess from there, I mean, if you think co-production is reasonable in some of these settings, and I think maybe HS2, it's too big a project really, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But like some more local infrastructure projects, like you mentioned the nuclear plant, or you mentioned, actually maybe you haven't mentioned it, but you've mentioned it to me before, this tidal slipway for sewage management. That seems to be a slightly more local project. So if it is a bit more local like that, maybe it is more reasonable to get the local community directly involved in project designs. But then if you are going to do that, like, how do you do that? What's the kind of reasonable way of doing that? And then we'll come to the dark side.
Yeah, so I should say Tideway and Sizewell are also large-scale projects.
All right, okay.
But I think, so, and this may touch on your comment on NIMBYs. Part of it, and again, this goes back to your research, right? And the approach to co-production. Part of the challenge, and I actually may have gotten this from you, part of the challenge is that the people involved in the consultations at the moment, because it's not necessarily compensated, may represent certain interests, right? Certain interests. You wouldn't necessarily get a low-income sort of family who will be directly impacted on the project coming to comment on the concept of the project, because they have to go to work, right? Yeah. So there may be something to be said, and this again draws on your work about paying people to be part of the consultations, and also about actually listening and listening to what they say and incorporating into the concept, right? Because it wouldn't take much for people to be involved in consultations and realize, actually, this is just a checkbox exercise, and what we're saying isn't getting incorporated. We won't do this again, right?
Yeah.
So, and this comes to developing a sense of trust, which is a prickly topic, particularly now in the context of polarized politics, etc. But developing a sense of trust that what they are saying is of value, one, you pay them, and that it will be incorporated into our conceptualization of the project, right? So there's more, there can be more done, or more can be done about this, but at the same time, there have to be incentives in the system for people to do these things, right? So local authorities might think, yes, great, it would be great to involve local community members, but our budget is tight, we have a million things to do, our timing is tight, so how, when, why, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the process can definitely be improved, but it requires both resources and it requires a realistic assessment of the capacity for it to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also struck that when most of the kind of successful co-production things that I've come across in a sort of governance context tend to involve institutionalization of the co-production process, and that way you can sort of develop a register almost of co-production partners who are reliable and committed to the process and don't dominate discussion. They are good participants in the discussion. They sort of respect other people's opinions and engage thoughtfully in the debate and that sort of stuff. Because I'm obviously a big evangelist for co-production, but I also it's so easy for it to go really wrong, and it's highly disruptive to your everyday business when it does go wrong. So I can see why there's a lot of resistance to it. And then one of the main things that always comes up and that I'm always leery of, because I'm such a massive YIMBY, is that I'm really always concerned that when you empower local groups, at least in cases where they are not the only stakeholders, you run into this NIMBY problem. So a parallel example that doesn't really relate to infrastructure, but just to illustrate the problem is, I was at a presentation recently where someone was talking about a right to the city, fairness. But really what they were talking about was the right of local residents to the city as opposed to the tourists. And I was like, well, the tourists also have a right to the city. You know, this is like the cultural heritage of humanity. And we need to balance both sets of stakeholders. So just in your work so far on local involvement and collective action infrastructure, how does NIMBYism, so not in my backyard attitudes, figure in? And is there any interesting thinking around that?
Well, I haven't focused too much on NIMBYism, right? So because I'm interested in how are we getting, in my research at least, I'm interested in how are we as a collective developing the project, and NIMBYs tend to, in principle, be against the project, so not interested in developing it, right?
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, NIMBYism has to, I guess their views have to be weighed against their interests as a collective versus the potential greater social good, right?
Yeah.
So there is something to be said about, for example, protecting areas of natural beauty, especially when we consider things like climate change, air quality, need for green spaces, etc. But this has to be weighed against the extent to which it could potentially provide people with access to jobs or access to, you know, public services, etc. And this is not necessarily the case in the HS2 context. It's not a great example of this, but I think, yeah, you have to weigh the potential broader benefits of projects against the interests of sometimes small collectives. And this again goes back in part to the idea of, let's say, post-apartheid South Africa and spatial legacies, because again, decisions we make today can have long-lasting effects, right? So we might be protecting the place, for example, that NIMBYs are interested in for literally generations, while creating denser places, you know, less attractive places for a wider majority.
Yeah.
So it has to be weighed against each other.
Okay. Why is HS2 not a great example of these things?
Because HS2 is not necessarily a rail line for the masses.
Okay.
So in terms of potentially how much it would cost, in terms of the people who would be able to sort of live in one place and commute to another for work. Yeah, I think debatable.
Okay, sure.
It definitely has a large NIMBY presence.
Yeah.
But I guess in the context of access to jobs, etc., yeah, the details of that are debatable.
Okay, so one thing I'm interested in hearing more about is like successful examples of local involvement in infrastructure development. One that I've come across was quite old now, I think almost like late 90s. In Canada, they did quite a lot of co-production around siting nuclear waste, because obviously that needs to go somewhere, and obviously no one wants it. So how do you get a community to agree to it? And co-production was actually really necessary because you had to have a kind of earnest, genuine conversation with the community to say, look, we respect that you have all these concerns and we want to make sure that you're adequately compensated for us siting waste here, and we want you guys to trust that you will be compensated to such a large extent that you're actually like, you voluntarily accept the siting of this waste. We don't have to like force it upon you. And I think that that kind of ties together a lot of the themes of our conversation around transparency and compensating people and whether they trust the governance structures and that sort of thing. And my understanding is that that process was successful in finding places where hazardous waste was sited, and then the community got substantial transfer of funds as a result of that they used to pay for all sorts of other local goods. Have you come across in your own work or in your research examples of where local involvement or some kind of collective action infrastructure was sort of transformative for the outcomes of a project?
I think I would say the closest I have seen of that process would be with HS2. Right?
Okay, yeah.
And the way that they incorporated and amended some of the station location decisions. But again, as I said earlier, this is at the level of the station and not at the level of the railway network.
Okay.
I think, I'm definitely interested in further research around this. And there's probably a lot out there, but in terms of my own exposure to this, I think HS2 would be the primary example. And I've seen recently also sites in looking for a site for nuclear waste. The government has been engaging with local authorities to determine and local authorities can volunteer to have the local waste sited in their locality. Okay. Obviously with benefits to them, right? But yeah, I think definitely more research, at least from my reading, which may be limited in this space, needs to be done in this area.
Okay, well, so that brings me quite nicely to my last question, which is I know you're of the view that we need more multidisciplinarity in infrastructure research. So why is that, and what's needed?
Yeah. So I think the way infrastructure has been studied to date is in disciplinary silos. So there is the macro sort of economics view of infrastructure. How does the investment, what are the implications for the investment on growth and development, right? How do countries, what is sort of capital investment in countries, how does that impact the growth trajectory? And then you have an engineering perspective, which is very technical and which is very much rooted in the idea of the golden triangle. How do we focus on projects, and how do we get, or the iron triangle, how do we get projects delivered, to time, to cost, to quality?
Yeah, right? Okay.
But there is something to be said also, reflecting on our conversation about the social dimensions of infrastructure, right? So how does infrastructure affect people's lives? How does it affect places? And no single discipline can capture all of that stuff, which is important to varying degrees on infrastructure projects. Your infrastructure projects themselves bring together private investors, they bring together lawyers and involve an understanding of the institutional and regulatory environment. They bring together, as I said, engineers. There's so much going on, both in the actual construction and delivery of the project, in the planning of the project, in the operation of the project, and then in the background of all of those things that goes into the development of an infrastructure project. It's very easy for us to read news headlines that say the infrastructure project has gone up by X amount in cost, right? Sure. And to think, oh, the project promoter, the project sponsor, or whoever's developing the project is incompetent. Yeah. There is so much more going in at the background, right? It may well be that NIMBYs have taken over the project and they are stalling the decision making, right? It may be that they've made concessions for local development in local places that have increased the cost of the project. Yeah, there's a lot happening, and there are multiple dynamics at play that are not necessarily captured and cannot be captured through a siloed studying of infrastructure projects.
Yeah, right. Okay. And so we also, it sounds like, need to get in more kind of sociologists and ethnographers and that sort of thing and geographers, obviously. Geography doesn't exist as a field in Australia. So when I came to the UK, where it's sort of very alive and well, I was quite struck by it. But I'm actually teaching geography now. So I'm kind of like, no, this is really interesting. We should talk about these things more.
So is that your cue to then take it back to Australia? And then
maybe, and revive it. I mean, we did it in high school, but we just don't have faculties of it. And occasionally you get in economics faculties like urban geographers or something like that, and then definitely people doing sociological research on urban spaces and or just space in general. But yeah, we definitely don't have like faculties of geography. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to your future research, Mark.
Yeah, yours
in the
as well,
space
Rehema.
of geography.
Yeah. All right, well, wonderful. That was a really great conversation. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
ePODstemology.
If you enjoyed today's episode, my guests and I would be ever so grateful if you could please leave a review of ePODstemology on whatever podcast directory you use, and share, like, comment, or subscribe if those are options. Tell your friends about the show, and we'll see you next episode.